The sound of a rifle shot echoed across the plains as Catherine Adams watched her future crumble before her eyes. There, beneath the old oak tree where she'd once carved her initials alongside her betrothed's, stood Edward Wilson locked in a passionate embrace with none other than her own sister, Lillian. The bouquet of wildflowers Catherine had picked for their afternoon picnic slipped from her fingers, scattering across the dusty ground like the broken pieces of her heart. Montana Territory, 1878. Catherine had spent 22 years of her life in Timber Creek, a growing settlement nestled between rolling prairies and distant mountains. The daughter of a successful merchant, she had been courted by Edward Wilson, the banker's son, for nearly 2 years. Their wedding was planned for the coming month, with preparations already underway and invitations sent to neighboring towns. "How could you?" Catherine's voice trembled as she stepped into the clearing, her blue calico dress billowing in the afternoon breeze. Edward sprang away from Lillian, his face paling beneath his neatly trimmed beard. "Katie, this isn't—" "Do not call me that," Catherine interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. "Not anymore." Lillian, younger by 3 years, had the decency to look ashamed, though her hand remained firmly clasped in Edward's. Her golden hair so similar to Catherine's shimmered in the sunlight that filtered through the oak leaves. "Catherine, please," Lillian began. "We didn't mean for this to happen." "How long?" Catherine demanded, her eyes fixed on Edward. "How long have you been betraying me with my own sister?" Edward straightened his waistcoat, regaining his composure with remarkable speed. "Now, Catherine, there's no need for dramatics. These things happen, Lillian and I. We've discovered feelings that cannot be denied." 6 months, Lillian whispered, unable to meet Catherine's gaze. "Since Christmas." The revelation struck Catherine like a physical blow. Christmas, when Edward had presented her with a silver locket containing his portrait, promising eternal devotion. When he had dined with her family, sharing stories and laughter while his knee pressed against Lillian's beneath the table. "The wedding is off," Catherine declared, pulling the engagement ring from her finger. She hurled it at Edward's feet where it disappeared into the tall grass. "You deserve each other." She turned on her heel and marched away, ignoring their calls. Tears threatened, but Catherine refused to let them fall. Not here. Not where they could see her break. The walk back to town stretched before her like an eternity. With each step, Catherine's mind raced through the implications. The humiliation of calling off a wedding with only weeks to spare. The whispers that would follow her through town. The pity in people's eyes. Worse still was the thought of facing her parents. How could she tell them that their younger daughter had betrayed them all? Her father had already invested in expanding their home to accommodate Edward's expected position in the family business. By the time Catherine reached Main Street, her composure was hanging by a thread. She kept her head high as she passed the general store and post office, nodding stiffly to Mrs. Peterson, who called out a greeting from the millinery shop. "Miss Adams, Catherine." A deep voice halted her steps. She turned to find Fletcher Quinn, the newly arrived ranch foreman from the Rocking M, dismounting from his chestnut stallion. At 26, Fletcher had only been in Timber Creek for 3 months, bringing with him stories of cattle drives from Texas and years spent working the frontier. His dark hair curled beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his tanned face bore the weathered lines of a man who lived beneath the open sky. "Mr. Quinn," Catherine acknowledged, struggling to maintain her composure. "I'm afraid I'm in rather a hurry." Fletcher's green eyes narrowed with concern. "Are you all right, Miss Adams? You look—" He stopped himself, apparently thinking better of commenting on her appearance. "I'm perfectly fine," she lied, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "Begging your pardon, but you don't look fine at all." His voice softened as he stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that she could smell the leather of his vest and the faint scent of bay rum. "Is there something I can help with?" The genuine concern in his voice nearly undid her. Catherine had only spoken with Fletcher Quinn on a handful of occasions at church socials. Once at her father's store when he came to purchase supplies for the ranch, but there was something steady and forthright about him that had always struck her. "Unless you can mend a broken engagement and a shattered family, I'm afraid not," she said, attempting a smile that failed entirely. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Wilson," he said flatly. Catherine nodded, surprised that he had guessed so easily. "I'm sorry to hear it," Fletcher said, his hand moving to the brim of his hat. "Though if I may speak plainly, any man fool enough to let you go doesn't deserve your hand in the first place." The unexpected compliment caught Catherine off guard. "You're very kind, Mr. Quinn, but you don't understand the circumstances." "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But I understand character when I see it, and yours, Miss Adams, has always struck me as exceptional." Before Catherine could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of her father's store. She turned to see Edward striding purposefully down the boardwalk, Lillian hurrying behind him. "I can't face them," Catherine whispered, panic rising in her chest. "Not here, not now." Fletcher followed her gaze, his jaw tightening as he assessed the situation. Without hesitation, he untied a package from his saddle and handed it to her. "My horse is faster than their legs," he said simply. "Monarch will carry us both out of town if you'd like a moment's peace to collect yourself." Catherine hesitated only briefly before nodding. The thought of a public confrontation with Edward and Lillian was unbearable. Fletcher helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, before swinging up behind her. With a soft click of his tongue, the chestnut stallion trotted down a side street, carrying them away from the approaching pair. Catherine felt Fletcher's solid presence behind her, careful to maintain a proper distance despite their proximity. As they left the town behind, her tense shoulders began to relax incrementally. "There's a spot by the creek where I sometimes stop to rest," Fletcher offered. "It's quiet. We can wait there until you're ready to return." "Thank you," Catherine managed, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic hoofbeats. They rode in silence for several minutes, following a well-worn trail that wound through stands of cottonwood trees. The afternoon sun dappled the ground through the leaves, and the gentle sound of running water grew louder as they approached the creek. Fletcher guided Monarch to a grassy clearing beside the water and dismounted first, offering his hand to help Catherine down. She accepted, noticing the calluses on his palm, evidence of honest work and a life far removed from Edward's soft banker's hands. "Would you like to talk about it?" Fletcher asked as he loosened Monarch's cinch strap and led the horse to drink. Catherine sank onto a sun-warmed boulder, watching the clear water rush over smooth stones. "Edward has been involved with my sister for months, apparently." Fletcher's expression darkened. "Your sister?" That's he cut himself off, clearly searching for words that wouldn't offend her. "Unforgivable," Catherine supplied. "Cruel, heartless." "All of those," he agreed, leaning against a tree trunk with his arms crossed. "Though I was thinking of less polite terms." Despite everything, Catherine found herself smiling faintly. "As was I, Mr. Quinn, as was I." "Fletcher," he corrected gently. "If we're sharing confidences, we might as well use Christian names." "Fletcher," she repeated. The name felt comfortable on her lips. "I'm Catherine." "I know who you are, Catherine Adams," he said with a quiet certainty that made her look up sharply. "I've known since my first Sunday in town, when you stood up to Mrs. Hollister for criticizing the widow Jenkins' children." Catherine flushed, remembering the incident. Mrs. Hollister had been particularly vicious about the Jenkins boys' worn clothing, and Catherine had calmly but firmly reminded her that charity began with kindness, not criticism. "You notice that?" "I notice a lot of things," Fletcher replied, his gaze steady. "Like how you always make sure the Palmer kids get candy when they come to your father's store, even when their mother can't afford it. Or how you taught Sarah Miller to read after school when the teacher gave up on her." Catherine was startled by his observations. "You've been watching me." "Not in any improper way," he assured her quickly. "Just appreciating what I saw." The frank admission touched something in Catherine, a place that Edward's practiced compliments had never reached. Fletcher Quinn saw her not the merchant's daughter or the future Mrs. Wilson, but her. "What will you do now?" Fletcher asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Catherine sighed, picking up a small stone and tossing it into the creek. "Face the music, I suppose, call off the wedding, endure the gossip." She paused, her throat tightening. "Figure out how to live under the same roof as my sister." Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. "The talking will die down eventually. Folks will find something new to whisper about." "And my sister? That's harder," he admitted. "But you've got steel in your spine, Catherine Adams. I've seen it. You'll find your way through." They remained by the creek for nearly an hour, talking quietly as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Fletcher told her about growing up in Missouri, about the cattle drive that had brought him north to Montana, and his hopes of someday having land of his own. Catherine found herself sharing dreams she'd never voiced to Edward of perhaps teaching school, of seeing more of the country than just Timber Creek. As twilight approached, Fletcher helped Catherine back onto Monarch for the return journey. This time, she was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the respectful way his hands held the reins without touching her, the warmth of him at her back. "I can take you directly home if you'd prefer," he offered as they neared town. Catherine considered the option. By now, word of the broken engagement would have spread through Timber Creek like wildfire. Her parents would be waiting, demanding explanations. Lillian would be there, perhaps with Edward at her side. "No," she decided. "The store first. I need to speak with my father before facing the rest of the family." Fletcher nodded and guided Monarch toward Adams' general merchandise. The main street was quieter now, with most businesses closed for the evening, though light still spilled from the saloon and hotel windows. As expected, her father's store was dark, closed for the day. But a lamp burned in the back office, visible through the window. Catherine knew her father would be there, finishing the day's accounts as he did every evening. Fletcher helped her dismount, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "Will you be all right?" "I don't know," Catherine answered honestly. "But I have to face this sooner or later," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "If you need anything at all, you know where to find me." "Thank you, Fletcher, for everything today." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then hesitated. "Catherine, I know this isn't the right time, but once the dust settles, I'd be honored if you'd allow me to call on you properly." The unexpected offer caught her by surprise. "You would, even after all this scandal?" "Especially after," he said firmly. "A woman who holds her head high through something like this is exactly the kind of woman worth courting." Despite the chaos of the day, Catherine felt a small flicker of warmth in her chest. "I think I'd like that, Fletcher." With a final nod, he mounted Monarch and turned the horse toward the livery stable. Catherine watched him go, then squared her shoulders and unlocked the store's front door with the key she always carried. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered. "Papa," she called, making her way through the darkened shop toward the light in the back. Joseph Adams looked up from his ledger as she entered the office, his weathered face lined with concern. "Catherine, we've been worried sick. Your mother sent your brother to look for you hours ago." I needed time to think, she said, sinking into the chair across from his desk. Her father studied her face in the lamplight. So it's true, then. What Edward came to tell us, Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. What exactly did Edward say? That the engagement is off. That he and Lillian have formed an attachment. Joseph's voice hardened. He had the gall to ask for my blessing to court your sister instead. And what did you tell him? Catherine asked, barely breathing. Her father's fist came down on the desk, rattling the inkwell. I told him to get out of my house and never darken our doorstep again. What kind of man does he think I am? What kind of father would I be to allow such a thing? Relief washed over Catherine. She had not doubted her father's love, but in small towns like Timber Creek, practical considerations sometimes outweighed sentiment. Edward was still the banker's son, a good match for any merchant's daughter. And Lillian? She asked quietly. Joseph's expression grew troubled. Your mother is beside herself. Lillian locked herself in her room after Edward left. This will be difficult for everyone, Catherine. But know this, he reached across the desk to take her hand. You have done nothing wrong. The shame is theirs, not yours. Catherine squeezed her father's hand gratefully. There's something else you should know. Fletcher Quinn escorted me today when I needed to escape. He's asked permission to call on me once this all settles. Joseph's eyebrows rose. Quinn, the foreman from the Rockingham. At Catherine's nod, he continued, he's a good worker from what I hear. Honest. Ambitious, he paused. Not as established as Wilson, of course. No, Catherine agreed, but perhaps with more character. Her father studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Character counts for a great deal in this life, more than bank accounts and family connections when it comes to true happiness. He smiled faintly. Tell Quinn he's welcome in our home if that's what you want. It is, Catherine said, surprised by the certainty she felt. Not right away, but... Yes. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of painful adjustments and whispered conversations that stopped whenever Catherine entered a room. As Fletcher had predicted, the gossip was relentless. Some blamed Catherine, suggesting she must have driven Edward away. Others condemned both Edward and Lillian as heartless betrayers. A few practical souls simply shrugged and remarked that these things happened sometimes, and wasn't it better to discover the truth before vows were exchanged at home? The atmosphere was unbearably tense. Lillian remained mostly in her room, emerging only for meals which passed in strained silence. Their mother, Martha Adams, vacillated between tearful disappointment in her younger daughter and anxious concern for Catherine's prospects. You're 22 now, Martha reminded her during one particularly difficult evening. If you don't secure another match soon. Martha, Joseph warned from the head of the table. Catherine has time. Catherine pushed her untouched stew around her plate. I'm not concerned about finding a husband at the moment, Mother. Well, you should be, Martha insisted. The Quinn boy is interested, your father says. He's not what we hoped for you, but under the circumstances, that's enough, Joseph interrupted firmly. Catherine will make her own decisions about Fletcher Quinn or any other suitor. Lillian, who had been silently picking at her food, suddenly looked up. Edward asked me to marry him, she announced. The table fell silent. Catherine's spoon clattered against her plate. Absolutely not, Joseph said, his voice dangerously quiet. I've made my position on that match perfectly clear. I'm 19, Lillian countered, her chin lifting defiantly, old enough to make my own choice. While you live under my roof, then perhaps I won't live under your roof much longer. Lillian pushed back from the table and fled upstairs, leaving her family in stunned silence. Catherine excused herself moments later, unable to bear the weight of her mother's distress and her father's anger. She retreated to the small garden behind their house, sitting on the bench beneath the apple tree that had been her sanctuary since childhood. The creak of the garden gate made her look up. Her younger brother Matthew, 16 and growing too fast for his clothes, approached hesitantly. "Katie." "Are you all right?" She made room for him on the bench. "As all right as can be expected, I suppose." Matthew sat beside her, his lanky frame awkward with adolescence. "Lillian's packing a bag," he reported. "I think she means to leave tonight." Catherine closed her eyes briefly. "To go to Edward." "I reckon so." They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the chirp of crickets and the distant piano music from the hotel down the street. "She's making a mistake," Catherine finally said. "Not just because of what they did to me, but because Edward isn't what he seems. He'll break her heart too, eventually." "Should we stop her?" Matthew asked. Catherine considered the question carefully. No, she decided. She wouldn't listen anyway, and perhaps she needs to discover the truth for herself. Later that night, Catherine heard the soft scrape of Lillian's window opening and the thud of a carpet bag being lowered to the ground. She didn't rise from her bed, didn't go to the window to watch her sister's silhouette disappear into the darkness. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, wondering why the pain of this final betrayal felt almost like relief. Morning brought confirmation of Lillian's departure in the form of a note left on the kitchen table. Catherine found her mother weeping over it while her father paced the room, his face thunderous. "She's gone to stay with Edward's aunt in Helena," Martha managed between sobs. "They plan to marry there next month." Catherine picked up the note, reading her sister's familiar handwriting. "Dearest family, I know you cannot forgive me now, but I hope someday you will understand that love cannot always follow the paths we expect. Edward and I never meant to hurt Catherine. What happened between us was not planned, but once we recognized our feelings, we could not deny them. I have gone to Helena to stay with Edward's Aunt Margaret until our wedding. Please do not try to find me or change my mind. This is where my heart leads me." With deepest regrets and enduring love, Lillian Catherine folded the note carefully and handed it back to her mother. "She's made her choice," she said quietly. "Joseph, we must go after her," Martha pleaded. "She's too young to understand what she's doing." "She's old enough to know right from wrong," Joseph replied grimly. "And she's chosen wrong." Catherine touched her father's arm. "Let her go, Papa. Bringing her back by force won't change her mind or her heart." Joseph looked at his elder daughter, his anger giving way to sorrow. "When did you become so wise, Katie?" "Not wise," Catherine corrected with a sad smile. "Just learning to accept what cannot be changed." The following Sunday, Fletcher Quinn was waiting outside the church after services, his hat in his hands and his boots freshly polished. Catherine felt the stares and whispers as she approached him, but the warm smile that lit his face pushed all other concerns aside. "Miss Adams," he greeted her formally, mindful of the watching congregation. "I was hoping I might escort you home with your parents' permission." Joseph nodded his approval while Martha assessed Fletcher with newfound interest. After the briefest hesitation, Catherine took Fletcher's offered arm, feeling a spark of defiance as they walked past Mrs. Hollister and her gossiping friends. "You're causing quite a stir," Fletcher murmured, amusement coloring his voice. "Let them talk," Catherine replied. "They will regardless." As they walked the 3 blocks to the Adams home, Fletcher told her about the new calves at the ranch and his plans to join the cattle drive to the railhead in the fall. Catherine found herself laughing at his description of a particularly stubborn heifer named Mathilda, who had led the cowboys on a merry chase through the undergrowth. "Would you care to join us for Sunday dinner, Mr. Quinn?" Martha asked when they reached the house, her earlier reservations apparently forgotten. "We'd be pleased to have you." Fletcher accepted with genuine pleasure, and Catherine found herself seated beside him at the dining table that had felt so empty just days before. His presence filled the room with an easy warmth that eased the tension that had become their constant companion. Over the following weeks, Fletcher became a regular visitor to the Adams household. He called on Catherine every Sunday after church, and often stopped by the store during the week when his duties at the ranch brought him to town. Their courtship progressed with a comfortable naturalness that contrasted sharply with Edward's more calculated attentions. "He never asks about Lillian or Edward," Catherine remarked to her father one evening after Fletcher had departed. "Everyone else in town seems to find a way to mention them, but he never does." "That's because Quinn respects you," Joseph replied, glancing up from his newspaper. "He understands that some wounds don't need prodding." In mid-July, a letter arrived from Helena. Catherine recognized Lillian's handwriting immediately and took the envelope to her room before opening it with trembling fingers. "Dear Catherine, I write to you rather than to Mother and Father because I hope you, of all people, might find it in your heart to understand. Edward and I were married last week in a small ceremony at his aunt's home. I wish you could have been there. I wish things had happened differently between us all. Helena is beautiful, though I miss Timber Creek more than I expected. Edward has secured a position at the Territorial Bank here, and we have taken rooms in a respectable boarding house until we can afford our own home. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I do ask for it nonetheless. What I did was unforgivable, and yet I hope that someday you might find room in your heart to remember that we are sisters despite my terrible betrayal. Please tell Mother and Father that I am well and that I think of them daily. Your sister, Lillian Wilson." Catherine sat on the edge of her bed, the letter clutched in her hand, unsure what to feel. The hurt was still there, but duller now, overlaid with something that might eventually become forgiveness. Not yet, perhaps not for a long time, but someday. She tucked the letter into her dresser drawer without showing it to her parents. There would be time for that later, when the wound had healed enough that the news wouldn't reopen it. August brought scorching heat that baked the streets of Timber Creek to dust and sent townsfolk seeking the shade of porches and trees. Catherine was working alone in the store one particularly stifling afternoon when Fletcher arrived, his shirt darkened with sweat from the ride into town. "Water," she offered, moving to the barrel they kept behind the counter. "Much obliged," he accepted gratefully, draining the dipper she handed him in 3 long swallows. "It's hot enough to fry eggs on the rocks out there." Catherine smiled, enjoying the way his presence brightened even the most mundane moments. "What brings you to town on a day like this?" "Surely the cattle can survive without supplies until it cools down." "Not supplies today," Fletcher replied, setting the dipper aside. "I came to see you, actually. I have news." Something in his tone made Catherine's heart quicken. "News?" Fletcher removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "John Morgan is selling the north section of the Rockingham, 500 acres, including the creek and the old Perkins cabin." "And," Catherine prompted, sensing there was more. "And I've made an offer," Fletcher continued, his green eyes bright with excitement. "I've been saving every penny since I started working cattle, living lean and putting it all aside. It won't be the biggest spread in the territory, but it's good land. Enough to start a decent herd of my own." "Fletcher, that's wonderful," Catherine exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. "Your own ranch that's been your dream since you arrived here." "Part of my dream," he corrected, stepping closer to the counter that separated them. "But only part." Catherine felt a flush rising in her cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. "What's the other part?" Instead of answering, Fletcher reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. He placed it on the counter between them, a simple gold band, unadorned but beautifully crafted. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "My father gave it to her when they had nothing but hope and hard work ahead of them. I'd like to give it to you, Catherine Adams, if you'll have it and me." Catherine stared at the ring, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Fletcher, I know it's not as fine as what Wilson gave you," he continued, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "And I know the timing might seem too soon after everything that's happened. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of my feelings for you." Catherine reached across the counter to take his calloused hand in hers. "The timing is perfect," she said softly. "And the ring is perfect because it comes with no deceit, only honesty and hard work, just like you." Fletcher's face broke into a smile that transformed his features. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," Catherine confirmed, her own smile matching his. "Though we should probably ask my father's blessing before we make any announcements." "Already done," Fletcher assured her, lifting her hand to his lips. "I spoke with him last week. He made me promise to take care of you and to bring you home for Sunday dinners at least twice a month." Catherine laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "And you agreed to these terms?" "I'd have agreed to twice a week if that's what it took," Fletcher admitted, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Though I did draw the line at letting your mother redecorate the cabin before we move in." "Wise man," Catherine teased. Fletcher slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. "We'll need to fix up the cabin before winter comes. It's sturdy enough, but needs a woman's touch." "Our home," Catherine said wonderingly, looking down at the simple gold band that represented so much more than her previous engagement ring ever had. "Our beginning," Fletcher corrected, leaning across the counter to press a chaste but promising kiss to her lips. The wedding took place in early October, after the cattle drive returned and the first hints of gold touched the cottonwood trees along the creek. Unlike Catherine's planned wedding to Edward, this ceremony was simple, held in the small white church with only family and close friends in attendance. Catherine wore a new dress of dove-gray silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered that morning. Fletcher waited for her at the altar, his usually casual demeanor replaced by nervous anticipation that melted into awe as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The words they exchanged were traditional, but the look that passed between them as Fletcher slipped his mother's ring onto Catherine's finger again held promises that went far beyond the standard vows. There was a small reception at the Adams home afterward, with Catherine's mother proudly serving a wedding cake she'd spent days preparing. Conspicuously absent were any members of the Wilson family, though Catherine had sent a brief note to Lillian and Helena, informing her of the marriage. As twilight fell, Fletcher helped Catherine into the wagon that would take them to their new home. They had spent the past month preparing the cabin, with Catherine making curtains and quilts, while Fletcher repaired the roof and built new furniture. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, a beginning built on truth and mutual respect. "Ready, Mrs. Quinn?" Fletcher asked as he took the reins, his voice warm with promise. Catherine leaned against his shoulder, watching the town of Timber Creek fall away behind them as they drove toward their land, their future. "More than ready, Mr. Quinn," she replied. "More than ready." Their first winter as husband and wife tested them in ways neither had anticipated. November brought early snow that lingered into December, with bitter winds sweeping across the plains and forcing them to remain indoors for days at a time. The cabin, though sturdy, revealed hidden drafts that Fletcher diligently sealed while Catherine learned to bank the fire to last through the night. Yet even in the harshest weather, they found joy in their togetherness. Fletcher taught Catherine to play poker during the long evenings, using beans instead of money as stakes. Catherine read aloud from the small collection of books they'd accumulated, her voice filling the cabin with stories of far-off places while Fletcher whittled by the firelight. They established patterns and rituals that became the foundation of their marriage, Fletcher bringing Catherine coffee in bed each morning, Catherine leaving notes in his lunch pail when he rode out to check the small herd they'd started. They learned each other's habits and quirks, finding ways to accommodate and appreciate the differences between them. "I never thought I could be this happy," Catherine confessed one night as they lay tangled together beneath the patchwork quilt she'd made for their bed. Outside, a January blizzard howled across the plains, but inside their cabin, all was warmth and contentment. Fletcher traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "Even with all the challenges, especially with the challenges," she replied, nestling closer to his solid warmth. "Overcoming them together makes the good moments sweeter." By spring, Catherine knew she was carrying their first child. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Fletcher, choosing a moment when they stood together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the newborn calves in golden light. "We'll need to add a room to the cabin," she said casually, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "By November, we'll need the space." Fletcher's brow furrowed in momentary confusion before understanding dawned in his eyes. "Catherine, are you saying?" She nodded, her smile blooming as brilliant as the wildflowers that carpeted their land. "We're going to have a baby." Fletcher whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet in a careful embrace before setting her down as if she were made of porcelain. "A baby," he repeated, wonder and terror mingling in his voice. "Our baby." "Our family," Catherine corrected, placing his hand over hers on her stomach. "The beginning of our family." The news of Catherine's pregnancy spread quickly through Timber Creek, bringing congratulations and renewed interest in the couple whose romance had blossomed from scandal. Martha Adams immediately began knitting baby clothes, while Joseph offered to help Fletcher with the cabin expansion. It was during this busy time of preparation that another letter arrived from Helena. This one, however, was addressed to both Catherine and Fletcher, and the handwriting belonged to neither Lillian nor Edward. Catherine opened it while Fletcher was out cutting timber for the baby's room, her curiosity overcoming her usual caution regarding anything connected to her sister. "Mr. and Mrs. Quinn, I regret to inform you of a situation requiring your attention. Mrs. Lillian Wilson has fallen gravely ill following the birth of her son 3 weeks ago. Her husband, Mr. Edward Wilson, was killed in a stagecoach accident while traveling on bank business last month, before the child was born. Mrs. Wilson has no one else to turn to, and in her delirium has called repeatedly for her sister. The physician believes she may not recover, and arrangements must be made for the infant's care. If you could come to Helena at your earliest convenience, it would be most appreciated. Mrs. Wilson is staying at 1420 Pine Street in the care of Mrs. Margaret Harrington, her late husband's aunt. Respectfully yours, Dr. Thomas Bradford. Catherine sank into a chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Lillian, a widow and mother, possibly dying. Edward gone. A baby boy, her nephew, with no one to care for him. When Fletcher returned an hour later, she silently handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his expression grave. "We need to go to Helena," he said simply. Catherine nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Yes. Can you travel, with the baby coming?" His concern was evident in the furrow of his brow. "I'm only 4 months along," Catherine assured him. "The doctor said everything is progressing normally. I can travel." Fletcher nodded decisively. "We'll leave tomorrow. I'll arrange for Johnson to watch the herd while we're gone." The journey to Helena took 3 days by stagecoach, each mile jolting Catherine's body and heart. She had not seen Lillian in nearly a year, had not fully forgiven her for the betrayal that had shattered their family. Yet now, facing the possibility of losing her sister forever, Catherine found that old wounds mattered less than the bond of blood and shared childhood. Helena was larger and more developed than Timber Creek, with brick buildings lining the main streets and a constant bustle of activity that spoke of the territory's growing prosperity. They found the address from the letter without difficulty, a neat 2-story house in a respectable neighborhood. The woman who answered their knock was in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair and weary eyes that brightened with relief at the sight of them. "You must be Catherine," she said, extending her hand. "The resemblance is remarkable. I'm Margaret Harrington, Edward's aunt." "This is my husband, Fletcher Quinn," Catherine introduced. "How is Lillian?" Margaret's face grew solemn. "Very weak, I'm afraid. The childbed fever has taken a terrible toll. The doctor was here this morning and he's not optimistic." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please come in. She's been asking for you." They followed Margaret up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom at the back of the house. The curtains were drawn, and the air smelled of illness and medicinal herbs. On the bed lay Lillian, so pale and thin that Catherine barely recognized her. Lillian. Catherine approached the bed hesitantly, Fletcher a solid presence behind her. Lillian's eyelids fluttered open, revealing fever-bright eyes that struggled to focus. "Katie," she whispered, her voice a thread of its former strength. "You came." Catherine took her sister's hot, dry hand between her own. "Of course I came. I didn't think, after everything. I'm so sorry, Katie." Tears slipped from the corners of Lillian's eyes. "So sorry for what we did to you." "Shh," Catherine soothed, brushing damp hair from her sister's forehead. "That's all in the past now." Lillian's gaze shifted to Fletcher, who stood respectfully at the foot of the bed. "You must be the cowboy," she murmured. "Mother said Katie found happiness." Fletcher nodded. "Yes, madam, we found happiness together." A ghost of a smile touched Lillian's cracked lips. "Good. She deserves better than what we gave her." A soft cry from the corner of the room drew Catherine's attention to a cradle she hadn't noticed before. Margaret moved to it, lifting a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. "Would you like to meet your nephew?" she asked, bringing the infant to Catherine. Catherine accepted the baby with trembling hands, looking down into a tiny face that bore Edward's nose and Lillian's chin. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "What's his name?" "Joseph," Lillian answered weakly. "After father." The gesture naming her son after the father who had disowned her brought fresh tears to Catherine's eyes. "He would be honored," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Lillian's hand clutched suddenly at Catherine's sleeve. "Promise me," she gasped, her voice urgent. "Promise you'll care for him if I can't." Catherine met Fletcher's eyes over the baby's head, seeing the answer in his steady gaze before she even had to ask the question. "We will," she promised, turning back to her sister. "Joseph will never want for love or family, I swear it." Relief washed over Lillian's face and she sank back against the pillows, her energy spent. "Thank you," she whispered. "I can rest now." For 3 days and nights, Catherine and Fletcher remained in Helena, taking turns sitting with Lillian while the other rested. Margaret proved to be a kind and practical woman who had already grown attached to the infant Joseph, but recognized her limitations as a caregiver at her age. "Edward was my only nephew," she explained as she and Catherine sat in the kitchen, preparing a broth for Lillian. "I was glad to provide a home for him and Lillian when they arrived, but I never expected this." She sighed heavily. "Edward left some money, but not much. The bank position wasn't as lucrative as he'd hoped, and he'd made some unwise investments." "What will you do now?" Catherine asked gently. Margaret smiled tiredly. I've been considering moving to California. My sister has been urging me to join her in San Francisco for years. With Edward gone, there's nothing keeping me in Montana anymore. On the morning of the fourth day, Lillian seemed to rally. Her fever broke during the night, and she was able to sit up and take some broth. Dr. Bradford, visiting for his daily check, cautioned against too much optimism, but admitted that it was a positive sign. "Catherine," Lillian said that afternoon as they sat together, baby Joseph sleeping in Catherine's arms. "Tell me about your life, your home, your husband." So Catherine did, describing the cabin by the creek, the small herd of cattle that Fletcher was building, the garden she had planted in the spring. She told Lillian about their plans for the baby's room, about the quilting circle in Timber Creek that had welcomed her as a new wife, about the letter she had received just before leaving, offering her a position teaching at the town school 3 days a week once her own child was old enough. Lillian listened with a wistful smile. "It sounds wonderful," she murmured, "so different from what I imagined for us, but wonderful." "It is," Catherine agreed, "different but right." "And Fletcher?" Lillian asked. "He's good to you, the best," Catherine answered simply. "He's honest and kind and strong in all the ways that matter." Lillian nodded, her eyes drifting to where Fletcher stood in the doorway, having just returned from errands in town. "I'm glad," she said. "So glad." That night, while Fletcher took his turn watching over Lillian, Catherine wrote a long letter to her parents, explaining everything that had happened and their intention to bring Joseph home with them when Lillian recovered enough to travel. She didn't ask for their forgiveness of Lillian, knowing that would take time, but she did ask for their acceptance of their grandson. When Catherine relieved Fletcher at dawn, she found Lillian sleeping peacefully, her breathing more regular than it had been since their arrival. For the first time, Catherine allowed herself to hope that her sister might truly recover, that Joseph might know his mother's love as well as his aunt and uncle's care. But it was not to be. When Dr. Bradford arrived for his morning visit, he found that while Lillian's fever had broken, the infection had weakened her heart beyond repair. She slipped away quietly just after noon, with Catherine holding one hand and Fletcher the other, baby Joseph sleeping peacefully in his cradle, unaware that his world had changed forever. The funeral was small and dignified, arranged by Margaret with input from Catherine. Edward had been buried the month before in the same cemetery, and Lillian was laid to rest beside him, their brief marriage and shared tragedies uniting them in death as in life. "What happens now?" Margaret asked as they stood in her parlor after the service, baby Joseph cradled against Fletcher's broad chest with surprising naturalness. "We take Joseph home," Catherine said simply. "We raise him as our own, alongside his cousin." She placed a protective hand over her growing belly. Margaret nodded, relief evident in her tired face. "I've gathered his things, what little he has, and there are some papers. Edward's will, what remains of their accounts. It isn't much, but it rightfully belongs to Joseph when he's of age. We'll keep it safe for him," Fletcher promised. "And we'll make sure he knows about his parents when he's old enough to understand." The journey back to Timber Creek was slower and more careful than their hasty trip to Helena had been. Baby Joseph proved to be a good traveler, soothed by the rocking of the stagecoach and the deep rumble of Fletcher's voice as he told stories to pass the time. Catherine watched her husband with the infant, marveling at the gentleness in his calloused hands and the patience in his eyes when Joseph fussed. "You're a natural," she remarked during one stop to change horses. Fletcher smiled ruefully. "Not sure I'd go that far. But I had 7 younger siblings back in Missouri. Reckon some of those skills are coming back to me." "He's lucky to have you," Catherine said softly. "We both are." Fletcher's free arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Family isn't always what we expect, Catherine. But we'll make a good one, you and me. For Joseph, for our little one on the way, and for any others that might come along." Catherine leaned into his strength, finding comfort in the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Yes," she agreed. "We will." News of their return and the addition to their family spread through Timber Creek before they'd even reached the outskirts of town. By the time Fletcher guided the rented wagon down Main Street toward the general store, a small crowd had gathered, curious to see the baby and hear the story firsthand. Martha Adams burst into tears at the sight of her grandson, reaching for him with trembling hands. Joseph, to Catherine's relief, went willingly to his grandmother, staring up at her with solemn blue eyes that held no recognition but no fear either. Joseph Adams' reaction was more measured, his grief for his younger daughter warring with his joy at this unexpected grandson. "He has Lillian's chin," he said gruffly, one finger gently tracing the baby's face. "And her spirit, I think," Catherine added. "He hardly cries, but when he does, the whole world knows about it." That evening, as they finally returned to their cabin with Joseph, Catherine felt the weight of the past week settle fully upon her shoulders. While Fletcher settled the baby in the cradle he had hastily constructed before their departure for Helena, Catherine stood in the doorway of their home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "Are you all right?" Fletcher asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her expanding waistline. Catherine leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I will be," she answered honestly. "It's a lot to process. Lillian, Edward, Joseph, everything that's happened. Too much." Fletcher's voice held a note of concern. "Taking on Joseph, I mean, with our own little one on the way." Catherine turned in his arms to face him. "No," she said firmly. "Joseph belongs with us. He's family." Fletcher's smile was gentle as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're an extraordinary woman, Catherine Quinn. Most would find it impossible to raise the child of the sister and man who betrayed them." "Joseph didn't betray anyone," Catherine pointed out. "He's innocent in all this. And perhaps this is how healing truly begins. Not by forgetting the hurt, but by finding love that's stronger than the pain." Fletcher's kiss was tender, a silent affirmation of her words and a promise for their future. "Then we'll build that love together," he murmured against her lips, "day by day for all our children." From the cabin, Joseph's hungry cry rose into the evening air. Catherine smiled against Fletcher's chest, feeling the rightness of this moment, this life they were creating together. "Day by day," she agreed, taking his hand as they turned toward the sound of their nephew, their son, and the beginning of their family's next chapter. The years that followed brought changes and challenges that tested the foundation Catherine and Fletcher had built. Their daughter Emma arrived in November, a robust baby with her father's green eyes and her mother's determined spirit. Joseph grew into a sturdy toddler with a sunny disposition that charmed everyone in Timber Creek, the circumstances of his birth gradually fading from local gossip as he became simply one of the Quinn children. When Emma was 2 and Joseph 3, Catherine gave birth to twins Michael and Sarah, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm that nearly prevented Fletcher from reaching the doctor in time. The cabin, already expanded once for Joseph, required another addition to accommodate their growing family. "We're going to need a bigger house at this rate," Fletcher remarked one evening as they watched all 4 children playing on the porch. The ranch had prospered under his careful management. The original 500 acres now expanded to nearly 1,000, with a respectable herd of cattle and several fine horses. "Are you complaining, Mr. Quinn?" Catherine teased, though her back ached from a day spent chasing toddlers while teaching Joseph his letters. Fletcher's arms slid around her waist, pulling her against his side. "Never," he assured her, "though I might suggest a pause before we add any more little Quinns to our brood." Catherine laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Agreed." As the children grew, so did the ranch and their connection to the community. Fletcher was elected to the town council when Joseph was 7, his straightforward manner and fair judgment earning him respect throughout the county. Catherine continued teaching part-time at the school, her natural affinity for education making her a favorite among students and parents alike. Joseph's 10th birthday brought a letter from San Francisco Margaret Harrington, writing to check on her grandnephew and to share news of her life in California. She enclosed a daguerreotype of Edward and Lillian taken shortly after their wedding, their young faces frozen in a moment of apparent happiness. "Should we show this to Joseph?" Fletcher asked that night after the children were asleep, studying the image in the lamplight. Catherine touched the faces of her sister and her former fiancé, the pain of their betrayal long since faded to a dull acknowledgement of human frailty. "Yes," she decided. "He's old enough to begin understanding, not everything at once, but the foundation of the truth." The next day, Catherine sat with Joseph beneath the old oak tree that shaded their front yard, the photograph between them. "These are your parents," she explained gently. "Your mother was my sister, Lillian. Your father was Edward Wilson." Joseph studied the image with solemn curiosity. "They died when I was a baby," he stated. It wasn't a question he had always known he was born to different parents than his siblings. "Yes," Catherine confirmed. "Your mother became very sick after you were born and your father had an accident just before that." Joseph traced the outline of Lillian's face with one finger. "She looks like you. We were sisters," Catherine said simply. "Just like you and Emma are siblings, even though you had different mothers." Joseph considered this, his young face thoughtful. "But you and Pa are my real parents now." Catherine hugged him close, her heart full. "Yes, Joseph, we are your real parents in all the ways that truly matter." As he grew into a teenager, Joseph occasionally asked more questions about his birth parents, which Catherine and Fletcher answered with as much honesty as was appropriate for his age. They never hid the fact that his parents had married under difficult circumstances, but they also never revealed the full extent of the betrayal that had brought Edward and Lillian together. "Some stories belong to the past," Fletcher said when Catherine wondered if they should tell Joseph everything once he reached adulthood. "What matters is that he came to us and that we love him as our own. The rest is just history." By the time Joseph turned 18, the Quinn Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. The original cabin, expanded and improved over the years, had been replaced by a comfortable 2-story home with enough bedrooms for their growing children and the occasional guest. Catherine's parents visited regularly, Joseph Adams having finally retired from the store and turned it over to Matthew's capable management. On a crisp autumn evening, as Catherine sat on the porch watching the sunset, Joseph joined her, his tall frame so like Fletcher's now folding into the chair beside hers. "I've been thinking, Ma," he began, his voice deep with emerging manhood, "about college in Denver." Catherine nodded, having expected this conversation. Joseph had always been studious, devouring books and showing an aptitude for mathematics that suggested a different path than ranching. "Your father and I will support whatever decision you make," she assured him. Joseph's fingers twisted the edge of his shirt, a gesture so reminiscent of Lillian that Catherine's heart caught. "Before I go, if I go, I'd like to know more about them, about what really happened." Catherine met his earnest gaze, seeing the man he was becoming beneath the boy she had raised. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," he said simply. "I'm old enough now, aren't I?" Catherine sighed, looking out over the land that had given her family so much joy and prosperity. "Yes," she agreed, "you are." That night, after the younger children were asleep, Catherine and Fletcher sat with Joseph in the study, the photograph of Edward and Lillian on the table between them alongside Lillian's letters and the legal papers Margaret had given them years before. Slowly, carefully, they told him the full story of Catherine's engagement to Edward, of the betrayal discovered beneath the oak tree, of Lillian's flight to Helena and Edward's death before Joseph's birth. They spoke of forgiveness found and family forged from painful beginnings. Joseph listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than angry or hurt. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me the truth, and for loving me despite how I came to be." Fletcher's hand clasped Joseph's shoulder firmly. "You are our son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing about how you came to us changes that. Nothing ever could." Catherine reached across the table to take Joseph's hands in hers. "Your mother loved you," she said softly. "Whatever mistakes she made, whatever pain she caused, she loved you enough to make sure you would be cared for. Remember that always." Joseph nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I will." As Joseph left for college that winter, Catherine stood with Fletcher in the yard, watching the stagecoach disappear down the road toward a future full of possibilities their son would now explore. "He'll be fine," Fletcher assured her, his arm warm around her shoulders despite the chill in the air. "We raised him right." "We did," Catherine agreed, leaning into his embrace. "All of them." Inside the house, Emma was helping the twins with their reading while 5-year-old Daniel, their unexpected late blessing, constructed an elaborate fort from sofa cushions. The sounds of their laughter drifted through the open door, a testament to the life Catherine and Fletcher had built together. "Did you ever imagine this?" Catherine asked, gesturing toward their home and the sprawling ranch beyond. "That day by the creek when you offered me escape from Edward and Lillian." Fletcher's smile was warm as he turned her to face him. "Not the details," he admitted, "but the feeling. Yes. I knew even then that we could build something true together." Catherine reached up to touch the silver now threading through his dark hair, matched by the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting into the sun and laughing with their children. "Something true," she echoed. "That's exactly what we found, isn't it? Truth in love, in family, in forgiveness." Fletcher's kiss held the same tenderness it had 20 years earlier when he'd first offered her a ring without deceit and a future built on honesty. "Truth," he agreed as they turned toward their home and the family waiting inside. "And it's made all the difference."